A single mom janitor calmed the Vampire King's screaming daughter with a lullaby in the palace corridor at 3 a.m. Every royal nanny had quit within hours. What no one knew, the child hadn't spoken in 2 years, and the grieving Vampire King watching from the shadows had just found the only person who could reach her. Maya Torres pressed the mop head against marble and watched pink water swirl toward the drain. Her fourth bucket since midnight, her hands raw from bleach, and her lower back singing that familiar song of too many hours bent over too many floors. The palace contract paid triple her diner wage, but the night shift meant she only saw Jamie at breakfast before school, kissed his forehead while he ate cereal half asleep, her son growing up in those stolen morning minutes while she scrubbed blood from stone that cost more than her annual rent. 2:47 a.m. Blinked on her phone screen when the screaming started. Not the polite distress of a child wanting attention, but something animal and raw that echoed through the East Wing corridors like glass dragging across metal. Maya straightened, vertebrae popping, and 3 security guards sprinted past her in formation, boots hammering marble, radios crackling with coordinates she didn't understand. They were back in less than a minute. One had claw marks down his face, 4 parallel lines welling red, and he was the lucky one judging by how the others looked at the floor and kept walking. The screaming continued, rising and falling, and Maya found herself moving toward it, mop forgotten in the bucket, her feet carrying her past portraits of severe faces and silver sconces that burned with bulbs shaped like candles. The smell hit her first when she turned the corner into the residential wing, night-blooming jasmine so thick it was almost chemical, like the palace pumped it through vents to cover something else underneath, old stone and metal, and something copper she didn't want to name. Moonlight fell through arched windows onto a small girl in a white nightgown, surrounded by shattered glass, her bare feet planted in the wreckage. Her face contorted and wet, and so young it made Maya's chest tighten, with the same reflex that woke her when Jamie coughed in his sleep 3 rooms away in their old apartment. The child was thrashing, arms flailing at nothing, and every adult in the corridor kept 10 feet back like there was an invisible fence, guards and a woman in a gray uniform and someone who might have been a doctor, all watching with the careful stillness of people who'd been hurt before. Maya took 2 steps closer, and a guard moved to block her, his hand up, his voice low and urgent when he said, "You can't go in there, ma'am. She'll hurt you." Maya looked at the girl, really looked, and saw the trembling underneath the rage, the way her fingers curled like she was trying to hold something that kept slipping away, the hiccup between screams that sounded like drowning. "She's scared, not dangerous," Maya said, barely above a whisper. And she didn't wait for permission, because permission would mean thinking, and thinking would mean remembering she was a janitor who cleaned blood for minimum wage and had no business stepping into whatever this was. She dropped to her knees 10 feet from the girl, glass crunching under her polyester work pants, and started humming the lullaby her grandmother sang when Maya was small and the world was too big and too loud, a melody with no words, just sound, rising and falling like breathing. The screaming stopped. The corridor went so quiet, Maya could hear the surveillance cameras adjusting in their mounts, that tiny mechanical whir, red lights blinking in every corner like eyes that never closed. The girl stared at her, eyes wide and wet, her whole body shaking, and for 3 heartbeats nothing moved. Not the guards, not the gray uniformed woman, not the moonlight on the glass. Then the child took 1 step forward, barefoot crunching on a shard, and Maya saw blood well up, but the girl didn't seem to notice. She just kept staring like Maya was a ghost, or a memory, or something she'd been waiting for, and then her face crumpled and she collapsed into sobs, her small body folding in on itself, knees hitting marble. Maya's hands lifted automatically, reaching, but she stopped herself, held still, kept humming, and the girl cried with the kind of abandon that only comes when you've been holding everything in for so long, your bones hurt. Movement in her peripheral vision made Maya glance left, and a man stepped from an alcove she hadn't noticed, shadows peeling away from him like he'd been part of the wall. And even kneeling on glass-covered marble, with her back screaming and her hands shaking from exhaustion, Maya recognized power when she saw it. The vampire king was taller than the portrait suggested, leaner, his face carved into angles that caught the moonlight wrong, too sharp, too still. But his eyes were wet. He stared at Maya like she'd just performed a miracle or a crime, and he hadn't decided which, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing too controlled, the kind of control that meant everything underneath was chaos. He wore black on black, simple and expensive, no crown or cape or any of the theater Maya expected. Just a man who looked like he hadn't slept in months watching his daughter cry on a floor covered in glass, while a janitor hummed a lullaby she learned 30 years ago in a kitchen that smelled like flour and sung in Spanish. The girl's sobs were quieting, her breathing evening out, and Maya kept humming, kept still, and watched the vampire king watch his daughter, grief and shock and something desperate moving across his features like weather. Behind him, more guards had materialized, silent, positioned at doors Maya was certain had been empty seconds ago, and she understood with cold clarity that every moment since she'd stepped into this corridor had been observed, measured, recorded by the cameras, with their blinking red eyes and the vampire king himself standing in shadow. The gray-uniformed woman moved closer, cautious, and whispered something to the vampire king that made his jaw tighten, but he nodded once, sharp, dismissive. Maya's knees were going numb on the marble, and her humming was starting to falter, her throat dry, but she didn't stop because the girl was still crying softly, and any change might shatter whatever fragile thing was holding her together. The vampire king took one step forward, just one, and his daughter's head snapped up, her eyes finding him, and Maya saw the fear there, the way the girl's shoulders hunched like she expected to be struck. He stopped. He lifted his hands, palms out, empty, and his voice when he spoke was so quiet, Maya almost missed it beneath the jasmine smell and the hum of surveillance and her own pulse hammering in her ears. He said Elara, and the name hung in the air like a promise or a plea, and the girl, Elara, looked at him, and then at Maya, and then back at him, and Maya saw the choice happening in real time, the terrible weight of it on a 6-year-old's face. Elara took one step toward Maya instead of her father. The vampire king's expression didn't change, but something in him did. A tightening, a wound reopening, and Maya felt the weight of it like pressure before a storm. Elara knelt in the glass beside Maya, close enough to touch but not touching, her small hands fisted in her nightgown, and the sobs had stopped, but tears still tracked down her face, silent now, exhausted. Maya stopped humming, and the silence was enormous, the whole palace holding its breath, waiting. She wanted to reach out, to brush the hair from the girl's face, to do any of the things she did when Jamie woke from nightmares. But every instinct screamed that she was being tested, watched, that one wrong move would break whatever spell had allowed her to get this close. The vampire king spoke again, his voice still quiet, but carrying weight that made the guards straighten. He said, "What is your name?" And Maya understood he was asking her, not his daughter. His eyes locked on her face like he was memorizing it or deciding something irrevocable. "Maya Torres," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, her knees screaming, her back aching, her mind cataloging exits and distances, and the fact that she was trapped in a corridor with the vampire king and his daughter and guards who moved like ghosts and cameras that never blinked. The vampire king nodded once, slowly, and said, "Maya Torres, you have done what no one else could do in 2 years, and now we must discuss what that means." The jasmine smell intensified, pumped through vents or growing from some hidden garden, and Maya realized with creeping cold that discussing what it meant was not optional, that she had crossed a line she hadn't known existed when she knelt on this marble and hummed a lullaby, and the vampire king watching from shadows had just decided she mattered, and mattering in this palace, in this world of surveillance and protocol and blood on marble floors, was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. The summons came at dawn, slipped under the staff dormitory door, while Maya stood in the shower letting hot water beat against muscles that felt like they'd been wrung out and left to dry. A cream-colored envelope with her name in silver ink and a wax seal she didn't recognize, but that looked expensive and old. She opened it with pruned fingers, water dripping onto the paper, and read the single line requesting her presence in the throne room at 6 a.m., 20 minutes from now. Signed with a single initial that could only belong to one person in this palace. Maya dressed in the only clean clothes she had left, jeans and a sweater that had seen better years, and followed a silent guard through corridors that looked different in early light, less like a palace and more like a museum. Everything behind glass or roped off or watched by cameras that tracked her movement with tiny mechanical adjustments. The throne room was black stone veined with silver, cold as a crypt, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the weight of years and power and decisions that changed lives without asking permission. The vampire king sat on a throne that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian, no cushions, no ornament, just brutal simplicity. And he stood when she entered, which surprised her enough that she stopped walking for half a step before catching herself. He gestured to a chair that had been placed in the center of the room, modern and out of place against the medieval stone, and Maya sat because standing felt like a challenge she didn't have the energy to make. The vampire king looked like he hadn't slept either, his face drawn, his eyes tracking her with an intensity that made her want to check if she had something on her face. And when he spoke, his voice echoed off stone, even though he wasn't shouting. He said, "I need you to take care of my daughter." And Maya opened her mouth to say she was a janitor, not a nanny, but he continued, laying out terms like he was reading from a contract he'd already written: live-in caretaker, triple her current wages, room in the staff wing, meals provided, full medical benefits. Maya let him finish and then said no. The word dropped into the throne room like a stone into still water. And the vampire king went very still, the kind of still that predators achieve right before they strike. And Maya's heart kicked against her ribs, but she kept her voice level when she said, "I have a son, Jamie. He's 8. He goes to public school across the city. I can't just leave him." The vampire king, Cassian. She remembered his name from whispered conversations between other staff members, tilted his head slightly and said, "Bring him here. We'll provide a private tutor, a suite in the family wing, not the staff quarters, better accommodations, protection." That last word hung in the air and Maya leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of the chair, and said, "Protection from what?" Cassian didn't answer. He looked at her like he was weighing how much truth she could handle and had decided the answer was not enough, and instead he said, "My daughter hasn't let anyone near her in 2 years. Every nanny quit within hours, some within minutes. She doesn't sleep, she doesn't eat unless forced. She broke a nurse's wrist last month, and last night you knelt on glass and hummed a song and she stopped screaming. So I'm asking you to stay and help her, because I don't know what else to do." His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, a hairline fracture in his composure, and Maya saw the exhaustion underneath, the desperation, the same helpless terror she'd felt when Jamie was 3 and had pneumonia, and she'd sat by his hospital bed counting his breaths. She said, "1-month trial. I need to see if this works, if Jamie adjusts, if your daughter actually responds to me beyond one night, and if it doesn't work, we leave and you don't stop us." Cassian nodded, once, sharp, and pulled a tablet from beneath his throne, swiped through screens with fingers that trembled just enough for Maya to notice, and turned it toward her, showing a contract with her name already filled in. Terms outlined in precise legal language she didn't fully understand, but that looked binding and permanent. She read it twice, asked for changes to the trial period clause, watched him make the edits in real time, and when she signed with her fingerprint, she felt like she was stepping off a cliff in the dark. No idea how far the fall, or what waited at the bottom. Cassian's relief was visible, a long exhale, his shoulders dropping half an inch, and he said, "You can move in today. I'll have your belongings transferred from your apartment." And Maya said, "I'll pack myself. I need to talk to Jamie, prepare him," and Cassian nodded again, but his eyes said he didn't trust her to come back if she left. And maybe he was right to worry because every instinct Maya had was screaming that she'd just made a terrible mistake. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a rhythm that felt like learning a new language, all the vocabulary familiar, but the grammar wrong. Maya's suite in the family wing was 3 times the size of her apartment. Hardwood floors and thick rugs and a fireplace that lit itself on a timer. But it felt like a hotel room, impersonal and sterile, the kind of place designed to be beautiful but not lived in. Jamie's room was next door, connected by an adjoining bathroom, and he'd stared at the space with wide eyes and asked if they were rich now, if this was permanent, if he could invite friends over. And Maya had answered maybe, and I don't know and we'll see, watching his excitement curdle into confusion. Elara appeared at Maya's door every morning at 7, silent, still in her nightgown, and waited for Maya to notice her, never knocking, never speaking, just standing there like a ghost, until Maya opened the door and said, "Good morning, sweetheart." The endearment had slipped out on day 2, and Alara's eyes had widened, something flickering across her face too fast to name, and after that, Maya used it deliberately. "Good morning, sweetheart. Time for breakfast, sweetheart. Let's brush your hair, sweetheart." Each repetition an anchor. Elara didn't speak, but she followed Maya everywhere, shadowing her through the suite while Maya folded laundry, or made beds, or tried to establish some routine in the strange luxury of the family wing. And slowly, increment by increment, the girl began to respond to gentle direction, sitting when asked, eating what was put in front of her, letting Maya brush the tangles from her dark hair with patient strokes. They started drawing with crayons at the low table in Alara's playroom, a space painted in soft pastels with toys scattered across the floor like a store display, untouched for so long they had a thin layer of dust. Elara drew the same thing every time, a house with 4 windows and a door, stick figures inside, her small hand gripping the crayon so hard it broke. And Maya drew beside her, houses and trees and dogs, anything to keep the girl engaged, to build trust through parallel play the way she had with Jamie when he was small and shy. Jamie was struggling. Maya saw it in the way he came back from tutoring sessions with the pinched expression he got when he was trying not to cry, in the way he barely touched his dinner, in the way he asked when they could go home in a voice that got smaller each time. He was afraid of the guards who stood at every corridor intersection, silent and still, afraid of the locks on the doors that required fingerprints he didn't have, afraid of the way sound didn't carry in the palace, every room dampened and isolated. He missed his friends, his school, his normal life where doors didn't lock from the outside and strangers didn't watch him through cameras. Maya tried to make it better, tried to explain this was temporary, a good opportunity. They were helping a little girl who needed them, but her words sounded hollow even to herself because she was starting to suspect temporary was a lie she was telling them both. She found the microphone on a Tuesday, tucked behind a stuffed elephant on a shelf in Elara's playroom, small and black and professional, the kind of equipment that cost money and required installation. Maya held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, and thought this isn't a job, it's a cage, the words crystallizing something she'd felt since signing the contract but hadn't wanted to name. She went looking for answers and found them in the form of a senior staff member, a woman named Helena who managed the household schedules and had worked in the palace for 20 years. Helena looked at the microphone Maya held out and her expression didn't change, no surprise, no concern, just a weary acknowledgement. Maya said, "Why is this in a child's playroom?" And Helena said, "The Vampire King needs to know she's safe. He monitors everything. Every room has surveillance. It's protocol." Maya said, "I wasn't told about this," and Helena said, "You weren't supposed to find them. Most people don't look behind the toys." And then she lowered her voice and said a piece of advice. "Don't try to leave. The Vampire King doesn't let anyone leave once they matter to his daughter. The last person who tried," and she stopped. her face closing down, and said, "Just don't try." Maya went back to her suite and sat on the bed and stared at the microphone and wondered how many were hidden in her own rooms. In Jamie's room, in the bathroom, in the spaces she thought were private. That night, Jamie came into her room and sat on the edge of her bed and said, "Mom, when can we go home?" And Maya said, "Soon, baby, just a little longer." And Jamie pointed at his window where moonlight outlined the decorative ironwork she'd thought was aesthetic, but now recognized as bars, beautiful and subtle and completely functional. And he said, "The windows don't open and the doors lock, and there are guards everywhere, and I want to go home." Maya pulled him close and smelled his shampoo, the familiar scent of her son, and said, "I know, I'm working on it," and felt him shake his head against her shoulder. The palace hummed around them, ventilation systems and automated locks and surveillance feeds processing in server rooms she'd never seen. Cassian's system running on schedules and protocols that treated people like variables to be monitored and controlled. Maya thought about Helena's warning, about the microphone in her palm, about the way Cassian's hands had trembled when he signed the contract, like he was afraid she'd disappear, and understood with cold certainty that she'd been right in the throne room when she'd asked to leave after the trial period, and he'd agreed too easily. He'd agreed because he knew she wouldn't want to leave once she cared about Elara, and if she tried anyway, he had a palace full of locks and guards and surveillance to stop her. Elara appeared in her doorway, silent as always, her small face pale in the hallway light, and she looked at Maya holding Jamie, and something moved across her expression, longing or recognition or grief. And Maya thought about the girl's mother who had died, who Cassian had mentioned once and never again, who had maybe sat in these same rooms and held her daughter, and realized too late that the palace was beautiful and comfortable and utterly inescapable. Maya set the microphone on her nightstand where the cameras could see it, a message to whoever was watching that she knew now, she understood the game, and Elara came closer, climbed onto the bed on Jamie's other side, and the three of them sat there in the humming silence of the palace while Maya tried to figure out how to protect her son and help a grieving child and escape a vampire king who had already decided she was too valuable to lose. The afternoon light came through gauze curtains in soft bars, turning dust motes into tiny stars, and Maya sat on the floor of her suite with her back against the sofa, watching Elara draw her endless houses while Jamie built a tower of wooden blocks he'd found in a cabinet, stacking them with the careful concentration of a child who understood that momentum and gravity were enemies that had to be respected. 3 weeks into the trial period, and Maya had stopped counting days until they could leave because Elara had started eating without prompting, had let Maya braid her hair that morning, had even laughed once when Jamie made a silly face across the breakfast table, a small sound like wind chimes that had stopped as quickly as it started, but had existed, had been real. Jamie was adapting in the way children do, making the best of a strange situation. And he'd started treating the palace like an elaborate game, memorizing guard rotations and finding shortcuts through corridors and cataloging which doors stayed unlocked. He was building his tower higher now, tongue between his teeth, and Elara had stopped drawing to watch him, her crayon motionless in her small hand, and Maya thought maybe this could work. Maybe 1 month could become 2, could become something sustainable if Cassian would just loosen his grip, let them have lives outside these walls. Then Elara spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, soft as paper tearing, and Maya almost missed it under the sound of blocks clicking together. But Jamie heard, and his hands froze mid-reach, and Elara said it again. "I like him." Her eyes on Jamie, her face uncertain like she wasn't sure if words still worked the way they used to. Maya's breath stopped in her chest. She didn't move, didn't speak, afraid any sound would shatter whatever fragile thing had just broken through 2 years of silence. And Jamie looked at Elara with his eyes wide, and then at Maya like he needed confirmation this was real. And when Maya nodded, he grinned, that big, unself-conscious smile that still had a gap where his front tooth was growing in, and said, "I like you too." Elara's expression did something complicated, relief and fear, and something raw moving across her small features, and she whispered thank you so quietly, Maya had to read her lips, and then the door to the suite slammed open hard enough to hit the wall. Cassian stood in the doorway, breathing like he'd run the length of the palace, his hair disarranged, his eyes wild, and he looked at Elara and then at Maya and back to Elara, and his voice when he spoke was breaking, fragments of sound that didn't quite fit together. When he said she spoke, you spoke, baby, you spoke. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees on the carpet beside his daughter, his hands reaching and then stopping, hovering, like he'd forgotten how to touch her or was afraid she'd disappear if he tried. Elara looked at him, her small face solemn, and repeated the words clearly this time. "I like him," pointing at Jamie, and Cassian made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, tears streaming down his face unchecked, his composure shattered into something human and desperate. He looked at Maya over Alara's head and said, "Thank you," over and over, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," and Maya felt her own eyes burning, because this was what she'd hoped for, what she'd been working toward, proof that Elara could heal, could find her way back from wherever grief had taken her. Cassian pulled something from his pocket. A silver bracelet delicate as spiderweb, filigree so fine it looked like lace, and he reached for Maya's wrist without asking, without hesitating, his fingers closing around her arm with surprising gentleness. Maya said, "Wait, what is this?" But he was already fastening the clasp, the metal cold against her skin for just a moment before it warmed, heating from the inside like it had a pulse, and she felt something shift in the air around her, a pressure change, a settling. Cassian sat back on his heels, still holding her wrist, his thumb over the bracelet, and said a promise. "No one in my court or beyond it can harm you. You're under my blood oath now. You and your son, protected, safe, nothing can touch you." His voice was fierce with gratitude and something else, something possessive that made Maya's joy curdle into cold understanding. She pulled her wrist free and looked at the bracelet, really looked, and saw that the filigree wasn't just decorative. There were symbols etched into the silver, old and precise, and the metal hummed against her skin with a low vibration like electricity or something alive. She said, "What does this mean exactly?" And Cassian stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand, his composure reassembling itself piece by piece, and said, "It's a kith mark, ancient vampire protection rite. It binds you to my household, to my bloodline. Anyone who harms you answers to me." Maya's mouth went dry. She said, "And if I want to leave, can I take it off?" And Cassian met her eyes, and his expression was unreadable, gratitude and possession, and something implacable underneath, when he said, "You won't want to leave." And when she just stared at him, he added as if it was an afterthought, a technicality. "The mark burns if you cross the palace grounds, just discomfort, not pain, a warning, and if you're attacked, I'll know instantly, I can find you anywhere." The temperature in the suite had dropped, Maya noticed, her breath not quite misting but close, and Cassian's presence filled the room like smoke, spreading into corners, pressing against walls, making the space feel smaller. She looked at Jamie, who was watching the adults with the careful wariness of a child who'd learned to read danger in faces and voices, and at Elara, who had gone very still, her drawing abandoned, her eyes moving between her father and Maya, like she was watching something break in slow motion. "Maya said I didn't agree to this, and Cassian said you did when you signed the contract. Protection was in the terms. This is how we protect, and legally you're bound to my household now, you and Jamie both. It's safer this way, you'll see." He said it like he believed it, like binding her magically and legally to a palace she'd been trying to figure out how to escape was a gift she should be grateful for. And Maya thought about Helena's warning. The vampire king doesn't let anyone leave once they matter to his daughter. and understood she'd been naive to think a trial period meant anything when Cassian had already decided the outcome. The bracelet hummed against her pulse point, and she wanted to claw it off, wanted to run, wanted to grab Jamie and break through the windows with their decorative bars and sprint across the grounds until the mark burned her skin raw. But Elara was watching her with those wide, solemn eyes, and had just spoken for the first time in 2 years, and Maya was trapped between the child she'd promised to help and the son she'd promised to protect. Cassian knelt again, this time in front of Maya, not Elara, and took her hands in his, the bracelet warming where his fingers touched it, and said, "You gave me my daughter back," I heard her voice. "I thought I'd never hear it again. You don't understand what that means, what you've done. I owe you everything, and now you're safe. Truly safe. No one can hurt you here." His gratitude was real. His tears had been real. But so was the bracelet locked around her wrist, and the guards Maya could see through the window shifting positions, forming a tighter perimeter, the palace closing ranks like it had been waiting for this moment. She said, "How do I take it off?" And Cassian said, "You don't. Only I can remove it or death. But why would you want to? You're protected, honored. This is the highest gift a vampire can give." And Maya heard what he didn't say, that she was his now, claimed, bound, that her miracle with Elara had sealed her fate. Jamie's tower collapsed, blocks clattering across the floor, and the sound made everyone flinch, brought them back to the present moment, the afternoon light still soft through curtains, dust motes still drifting, everything looking normal except for the silver on Maya's wrist, and the way Cassian watched her like he was afraid she'd vanish and determined to prevent it. Elara picked up a fallen block and held it out to Jamie, a small offering, and whispered sorry, and Jamie took it and said, "It's okay, I'll build it again." And the normalcy of the exchange was surreal against the weight of what had just happened. Maya touched the bracelet, felt it warm and alive against her skin, and thought about her apartment across the city that she'd never see again, about Jamie's school and friends, and the life they'd had before she knelt on glass-covered marble and hummed a lullaby. Cassian stood, smoothing his hair back, his mask of composure fully restored, and said, "I'll have your belongings moved from storage into permanent quarters, larger rooms. You'll want more space now that this is home." And he said home like it was decided, like her agreement was assumed. And Maya wanted to scream that she hadn't agreed to permanence, to magical binding, to being owned. But Elara was leaning against her shoulder now, warm and small and trusting. And Cassian was looking at his daughter with such naked relief that Maya couldn't find words that wouldn't destroy the fragile peace. The bracelet hummed its steady pulse, and Maya wondered if this was how it had started for Elara's mother. Small concessions that became larger ones. Gratitude that became obligation, that became captivity. And she looked at the windows with their bars and the doors with their biometric locks and the cameras in their corners, and understood she'd been living in a cage all along. She just hadn't noticed the door closing until now. Cassian moved toward the exit, paused, looked back at Maya with something almost like tenderness, and said, "Rest today. Tomorrow we'll discuss adjusting the contract terms, better compensation, perhaps a formal title. You're not just a caretaker anymore. You're family." And the word landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading, changing everything. He left and the temperature normalized, and Maya sat on the floor with Elara leaning against her, and Jamie building his tower again, and a silver bracelet humming against her wrist like a heartbeat or a countdown. And she knew with absolute certainty that she'd just lost a war she hadn't realized she was fighting. That the Vampire King's gratitude was more dangerous than his anger could ever be, and that the only person who could reach his daughter was now the one person he would never, ever let go. The market trip was Cassian's idea, a concession after Maya had spent 5 days barely speaking to him, her anger cold and controlled because Elara was always watching, always listening, and Maya wouldn't break in front of the child who had just found her voice and was using it to ask questions, to say please and thank you, to whisper goodnight before bed. Cassian had said you need fresh air, normalcy, Take Jamie and 2 guards and go to the market district. Buy whatever you want, my treat. And he'd handed her a credit card that felt like a leash disguised as generosity. The market was overwhelming after weeks inside palace walls, noise and color, and the smell of frying food and fresh flowers, people brushing past each other without fear or surveillance, living normal lives that felt impossibly distant from Maya's new reality. Jamie had run ahead to a stall selling wooden toys, 2 guards flanking him at a respectful distance, and Maya had sat at a cafe with a striped awning and ordered a cappuccino she didn't want just to feel like a regular person making regular choices. The woman in the gray suit sat down across from her without asking, her movements precise and controlled, her face unremarkable in the way that suggested professional training, someone who'd learned to be forgettable. She didn't order anything, just folded her hands on the small metal table and leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper when she said, "You don't know what you've walked into, do you?" Maya's hand went automatically to the bracelet hidden under her sleeve, the metal warm against her skin, always warm now. And she said, "I don't know you." And the woman smiled without humor and said, "I'm someone who knows what the vampire king does to people he decides he can't live without." The woman glanced at the guards watching Jamie, calculating distance and time, and said quickly, efficiently, like she'd rehearsed this, "He killed his wife to prevent her from taking Elara and fleeing, palace security, direct order. She was running and they stopped her the only way they could, and if you're not careful, you'll be next. Not killed, maybe, but kept, controlled, bound so tightly you'll forget what freedom tastes like." Maya felt ice in her stomach, her cappuccino forgotten, foam going flat, and she said, "Why are you telling me this?" And the woman said, "Because you're the catalyst. Word is spreading that Elara spoke, that you broke through when no one else could, and the Vampire King's rivals want to know who you are, what makes you special, whether you're an asset or a weapon, or just unlucky." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table, her fingers quick and subtle, and said safe house address. "Outside the city. They'll help you disappear if you want out, but decide fast because he'll never let you leave. He can't. It would destroy him and he'll destroy you first to prevent it." The bracelet on Maya's wrist suddenly burned hot, not discomfort but real pain, searing like she'd pressed it against a stove, and Maya gasped and jerked her arm back, knocking over her untouched cappuccino, brown liquid spreading across the metal table. The woman in the gray suit was already standing, already moving, disappearing into the market crowd with practiced ease. And Maya clutched her wrist, feeling the metal pulse against her skin, like it was angry, like it was alive and alerting something. The guards were moving toward her, radios crackling, and Jamie was running back looking scared, and Maya knew with cold certainty that Cassian was coming, that the bracelet had told him something was wrong, that she'd just been marked as threatened or threatening, and either way her small piece of freedom was over. He arrived in less than 3 minutes, a black car screeching to the curb, Cassian emerging before it fully stopped, his face a mask of controlled fury that cracked when he saw Maya holding her wrist, the skin underneath the bracelet red and inflamed. He scanned the cafe, the crowd, the guards who looked ashamed, and said, "Where is she? Who approached you?" And Maya said, "I don't know what you mean," even though they both knew she was lying. Cassian took her wrist gently despite his anger, examined the bracelet, touched the inflamed skin with fingers that were surprisingly cool, and said, "We're going home now," his voice leaving no room for argument. The drive back was silent except for Jamie's questions that neither adult answered, Cassian driving too fast through streets that cleared for his car like water parting, and Maya stared out the window at normal people living normal lives, and felt the distance between her and them stretching into something unbridgeable. Back at the palace, Cassian took her to his study, a room she'd never seen before, all dark wood and leather and books that looked older than the building, and he poured himself something amber from a crystal decanter and drank it in one swallow and said, "Tell me what she said." Maya stood by the door, ready to run, even though there was nowhere to go, and said, "She told me about your wife, how she died trying to leave, how you gave the order that killed her." Cassian's hand tightened on the empty glass, and for a moment Maya thought it would shatter, but he set it down with careful control and said, "Yes, I gave the order to stop her. She was taking Elara in the middle of the night, claimed I was dangerous, unstable, said she'd go to the Vampire Council and testify against me, and I told security to stop her at any cost, because I thought any cost meant restraint, negotiation. I didn't think it meant—" He stopped, his voice hollow. "She ran into traffic, tried to cross 6 lanes with Elara in her arms, and the guards pulled Elara to safety, but she didn't." The room was very quiet, just the sound of their breathing and the antique clock on the mantel ticking away seconds, and Maya said, "So you've kept Elara locked up ever since? Paranoid someone will take her, and now you've locked me up too. Put this thing on my wrist without asking." And Cassian turned on her with sudden intensity and said, "You don't understand. There are factions that would use her against me, hurt her to hurt me. The only way to keep her safe is to control every variable, every person who gets close. And you got close. You became the most important variable. So yes, I bound you to protect you and her and myself." Maya felt her anger finally break through the careful control she'd maintained for Alara's sake, and said, "You put this on me without asking. I'm not your wife. I'm not your prisoner." And Cassian crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and said, "You're the only reason my daughter is alive. That makes you irreplaceable, and irreplaceable means protected at all costs, just like he'd protected his wife right into traffic, right into death." Maya looked at him and saw the truth in his face, that he meant every word, that in his calculus protection and control were the same thing, that he genuinely couldn't see the difference between keeping someone safe and keeping someone captive. She touched the bracelet and said, "What if I try to leave anyway?" And Cassian said, "The mark will stop you. It burns hotter the farther you get from palace grounds. Eventually you'll collapse, and I'll find you and bring you back, because that's what it's designed to do. Keep you close, keep you safe." His voice held no apology, just statement of fact, and Maya realized argument was useless. He'd already decided her fate the moment Elara had spoken, maybe even earlier, maybe the moment she'd knelt on glass-covered marble and proven she could reach his daughter. She left the study without asking permission, went to her suite, and found Jamie in his room, packing a backpack with clothes and snacks and his favorite book. And when she asked what he was doing, he said, "We're leaving, right? That's what that lady meant, that we should leave." And Maya's heart broke because her 8-year-old son had understood the threat before she had. She said, "We'll try," and Jamie nodded, and they waited until midnight when the palace went quiet, when even the surveillance seemed to sleep, and they crept through corridors Maya had memorized, past guard stations she'd learned to predict, to the side gate she'd noticed was sometimes unmanned during shift changes. The gate was there, wrought iron and old, and Maya's hands were shaking when she pushed it open, the hinges silent because Cassian maintained everything perfectly, and she stepped through with Jamie's hand tight in hers. The bracelet went from warm to hot to searing in the span of 3 steps, pain shooting up her arm like electricity, and Maya gasped and kept walking because maybe it was a bluff, maybe she could push through. But by the 5th step, her knees were buckling, and by the 7th, she was on the ground, Jamie crying and trying to pull her back through the gate, and the pain was white-hot and absolute, the bracelet alive with fury. Floodlights snapped on, motion sensors triggered, and guards were running toward them, and through the pain, Maya saw Cassian walking calmly from the main building like he'd been waiting, like he'd known exactly when she'd try and had let her just to prove the point. He knelt beside her on the cold stone outside the gate, Jamie backing away from him, and Cassian picked Maya up like she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest, and walked back through the gate, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the pain stopped, the bracelet cooling to its normal warmth, merciful and horrible. Maya's last thought before she passed out was that the woman in the gray suit had been right. He'll never let you leave. He can't. It would destroy him. And Maya had just learned that his destruction mattered more than her freedom. When she woke, it was in her own bed. Soft sheets and dim light from a single lamp, and Elara was curled against her side, small and warm, her fingers wrapped around Maya's hand, and the bracelet hummed its steady pulse against Maya's wrist, like a heartbeat or a chain. Cassian sat in a chair by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight. And he didn't move when Maya's eyes opened, just said quietly, without looking at her, "I'm sorry you're hurt, but I'm not sorry I stopped you." Elara woke up screaming when she realized you were gone. She thought you'd died like her mother. She wouldn't stop until I brought you back. And Maya understood the full weight of her trap, that leaving wouldn't just hurt her. It would devastate the child she'd grown to love, and Cassian knew it, had built his cage around that knowledge. Elara stirred, whispered Maya without opening her eyes. And Maya stroked her hair with her free hand, the one without the bracelet, and thought about safe house addresses she couldn't use, and normal lives she'd never have, and a vampire king who confused love with possession and called it protection. And she knew she was living the same pattern as Elara's mother, but unlike her predecessor, Maya had nowhere to run because the bracelet made sure of it, and her own compassion made double sure, binding her more effectively than any magic ever could. The nightmares started on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Maya's failed escape. 3 weeks of careful distance between her and Cassian, speaking only about Elara's needs, her voice professionally polite, while the bracelet hummed its constant reminder against her wrist. Maya woke to screaming at 2 in the morning, not the raw animal sound from months ago, but words. Elara shrieking, "No, no, no, stop the car, stop, please, mommy, please." And Maya ran barefoot down the connecting hallway to find Elara tangled in her sheets, eyes open but unseeing, trapped in a memory playing behind her eyelids. Maya had pulled her close, rocked her, whispered, "It's just a dream, sweetheart, you're safe." But Elara had fought her, small fists beating against Maya's shoulders, screaming about blood and glass and mommy won't wake up. And it had taken 20 minutes for the girl to fully surface, to recognize where she was, to collapse into exhausted sobs against Maya's chest. The nightmares came every night after that. Same images, same terror. Elara reliving her mother's death in fragmented scenes that got clearer each time, more detailed. And Maya started sleeping on the floor beside Elara's bed to be there when the screaming started, to pull her out faster, to minimize the damage. By the end of the first week, Maya looked like she'd aged 5 years, dark circles under her eyes, her patience fraying, and she realized with cold clarity that Elara hadn't just been silent for 2 years. She'd been holding back a trauma so massive it had taken her voice, and now that the voice was back, the trauma was flooding through, demanding to be witnessed. Jamie was struggling too, woken every night by his pseudo-sister's screams, afraid to sleep, afraid of what he'd hear. And Maya watched her son withdraw into himself, and knew something had to change, or they'd all break under the weight of Cassian's need for control. She found Cassian in his study reviewing security footage, because of course he was, watching his daughter's nightmares on a screen instead of going to her himself, and Maya didn't knock, just walked in and said she watched her mother die. Keeping her in a cage won't erase that. She needs therapy, real help, not just me humming lullabies and hoping she forgets. Cassian looked up from the screens, his face drawn, and said, "No outsiders. We've discussed this." And Maya felt her exhaustion turn to anger, sharp and hot in her chest. She said, "I'm making you a deal then. Let a trauma counselor visit once a week, supervised, guards in the room if you want, cameras recording everything, and I'll sign a 5-year contract extension. I'll stop fighting the bracelet. I'll stay willingly." Cassian's expression shifted, surprise and calculation, and something hungry, and he said 5 years in writing, legally binding, and Maya said yes if you get Elara real help, because what I'm doing isn't enough, and we both know it. He agreed too quickly, pulled up a contract template on his tablet before she could change her mind, modified the terms while she watched, and Maya signed with her fingerprint, feeling like she was selling pieces of herself for a child's chance at healing. But what else was there to do when love and captivity had become so tangled? She couldn't separate them anymore. The therapist arrived the following Wednesday, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Sarah Chen with kind eyes and 20 years of pediatric trauma experience. And Maya watched her confidence evaporate the moment she entered the palace, guards flanking her, cameras tracking her movement. Cassian himself waiting in the foyer to explain the rules, the boundaries, the consequences of any breach of confidentiality. Dr. Chen's hands were shaking when she sat down in the playroom with Elara, Maya present as requested, two guards visible through the doorway, the surveillance camera's red light blinking in the corner like a watching eye. The session lasted 30 minutes before Dr. Chen stood, apologized to Elara with genuine regret, and said to Maya quietly, voice tight, I can't work like this. I can't help a child who's being watched by armed guards while I talk to her. This isn't therapy, it's performance. I'm sorry. She left her card on the table, told Maya to call if circumstances changed, and walked out past Cassian, who didn't try to stop her, just watched her go with an expression that said he'd expected this, had maybe even wanted it to prove his point, that outsiders couldn't be trusted. Maya stood in the playroom surrounded by scattered toys and pastel walls and the weight of Elara's trust, and decided that if professional help wouldn't come to them, she'd have to provide what help she could, even if it meant breaking more rules, crossing more lines Cassian had drawn. She waited until that evening when Elara was calm, fed, sitting on the floor drawing her endless houses, and Maya sat beside her and said, Sweetheart, I want to talk to you about your mom. About what happened the night she died? Is that okay? Elara's crayon stopped moving, her small body going very still, and she nodded once, sharp, like she'd been waiting for this conversation, dreading and needing it in equal measure. Maya kept her voice gentle, careful, and said your mom loved you very much. She wanted to take you somewhere she thought was safe. But she got scared, and there was an accident with a car, and she died. And it wasn't your fault, and it wasn't really anyone's fault. It was just terrible and sad, and I'm so sorry you had to see it. Elara's breathing had gone shallow, her eyes fixed on the drawing, and Maya continued. Your dad didn't want to lose you. He was afraid someone would take you away, so he keeps you very close and very protected, maybe too protected. But it's because he loves you, and he's scared too. The playroom felt claustrophobic suddenly, walls pressing in, toys scattered like debris, and Elara's voice when she spoke was tiny, fragile, when she asked, Are you going to leave too? Maya's breath caught, because this was the question, the central fear, and she could lie, could say, No, sweetheart, I'll never leave, could offer false comfort that would buy time and trust. But she looked at Elara's face, 6 years old and already too familiar with loss and lies. And Maya couldn't do it. She said, I don't know. I want to stay because I love you. And I want to help you. But I also want to be free to make my own choices. And right now, your dad won't let me leave even if I wanted to. And I don't know what that means for the future. Elara stared at her, and Maya watched the child process honesty she was too young to handle, watched her face crumple, watched her small hand reach for the glass of water on the table, and then Elara's fingers closed around it and she threw it against the wall where it shattered into glittering pieces, and she was screaming. Not words, just sound, raw and animal, like the first night Maya had heard her. Maya reached for her, but Elara was grabbing another glass, the small cup she used for juice, and she threw that too, and then she grabbed a shard from the first glass with her bare hand, and Maya lunged forward, shouting no, but Elara squeezed, blood welling between her small fingers, her screaming reaching a pitch that sounded like breaking. The door slammed open, and Cassian was there, cold wind and fury, his eyes taking in the blood and broken glass, and Maya frozen 3 feet away. And Elara saw her father and ran to him, leaving red footprints on the floor, her bleeding hand clutched to her chest. Cassian caught her, lifted her, his face over her small shoulder staring at Maya with an expression that was devastated and accusing in equal measure, and his voice when he spoke was shaking, barely controlled. When he said you were supposed to fix this, not make it worse. I trusted you with her, and you broke her again." Maya stood in the wreckage of the playroom, glass glittering on pastel carpet, blood in small pools, rain starting to lash against the windows outside like the sky was crying, and she said I told her the truth. She deserves to know what happened to her mother. She deserves honesty, even if it hurts. Cassian's laugh was bitter, sharp, and he said honesty. You told her you might leave. You made yourself into another loss. She has to fear. How is that helping? And Maya felt her own anger rise to meet his, because she was tired, so tired, of being trapped between his control and Elara's need, between her love for the child and her desperation for freedom. She said she asked me a direct question, and I wouldn't lie to her. I won't be another adult who tells her comfortable lies while controlling her life. And Cassian's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to something dangerous when he said, "You signed a 5-year contract 3 days ago. You're not leaving. That's not uncertainty. That's fact." Maya touched the bracelet on her wrist and said, "This thing makes sure of that, doesn't it? I couldn't leave if I wanted to. The choice was taken from me the moment you put it on. And Cassian said I gave you a choice. Stay and help her or leave and doom her. You chose to stay. You signed the contract. You don't get to pretend you're a victim now." Elara was crying against his shoulder, quieter now, exhausted, and Cassian carried her toward the door, paused, looked back at Maya standing alone in the broken playroom, and said, "I thought you were different. I thought you actually cared about her, but you're just like her mother, promising safety while planning escape." And his voice cracked on the last word, revealing the fear underneath the anger, the terror that history was repeating, that everyone he loved would eventually try to leave and he'd be forced to stop them. Maya said I do care about her. That's why I'm still here. That's why I told her the truth. Because she needs someone who treats her like a person, not a possession. And Cassian's jaw tightened, his composure barely holding, and he said, "You don't understand what it takes to keep her alive in a world that wants to use her against me. You don't understand the threats, the constant calculations." And Maya said, "You're right. I don't understand. Because you won't tell me. You just expect me to trust your control while you don't trust anyone, including your own daughter, with the truth." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid, years of grief and trauma and fear calcified into patterns neither knew how to break, and outside the rain hammered harder, the palace feeling like a pressure cooker about to explode, all that contained emotion looking for release. Cassian turned away, carrying Elara out of the playroom, and Maya heard him say to someone in the hallway, "Get Dr. Morrison to treat her hand." And then he was gone, door closing, leaving Maya alone with broken glass and blood and the surveillance camera still blinking its red eye in the corner, recording everything, judging nothing. She sat on the floor where Elara had been drawing, picked up the unfinished picture, a house with 4 windows and stick figures inside, and noticed for the first time that one of the figures was always separate from the others, standing by the door, neither fully inside nor outside, trapped in the threshold. And Maya realized Elara had been drawing her own uncertainty, her own fear of abandonment and loss, and Maya's honesty had just confirmed that fear was valid. The bracelet hummed its steady pulse, and Maya thought about the 5-year contract she'd signed, about Cassian's accusation that she was supposed to fix this, about the impossible position of loving a child whose father confused protection with imprisonment and called it care, and she understood they'd reached an impasse, a showdown that had no winners, just varying degrees of damage and survival. And the only way forward was through negotiation and compromise, and hoping that Cassian's love for his daughter was strong enough to make him loosen his grip before they all suffocated under the weight of his control. But Maya wasn't sure it wasn't sure he could, and that uncertainty felt like standing on crumbling ground, watching the edge get closer with every breath. 3 days passed in tense silence, Maya keeping to her suite like a prisoner who'd accepted her cell, emerging only for meals with Elara that felt choreographed and careful, both of them dancing around the broken glass conversation neither knew how to clean up. Elara's hand was bandaged, healing with the accelerated speed of vampire genetics Cassian had explained once in a rare moment of openness, and the girl was quieter now, watchful. Her nightmares continuing, but muted, like she'd learned to scream internally instead of out loud. Maya slept on the floor beside Elara's bed still, waking at the first sign of distress, and Cassian never came, never checked on his daughter in person, though Maya knew he watched the feeds, saw everything, judged her competence from the safety of his screens and his distance. Jamie asked on the second day if they were leaving, his backpack already half-packed again, hope and fear mixing in his 8-year-old face, and Maya had sat on his bed and said, "No, baby, we're not leaving," and when he asked why, asked if it was because of the bracelet, Maya had surprised herself by saying no, not because I'm trapped, because Elara needs me, and I'm not sure I can live with the guilt of abandoning her, and I need you to understand that this choice is complicated and hard, and I'm doing my best. Jamie had nodded like he understood, even though he was too young to really grasp the weight of adults making impossible decisions, and he'd unpacked his bag slowly, carefully, like he might need to repack it at any moment. On the fourth night, Maya couldn't sleep, her mind circling the same thoughts over and over. Cassian's accusation that she'd made things worse, Elara's question about whether Maya would leave, the 5-year contract that felt like a noose tightening incrementally, and she got up at 2 in the morning and walked the silent corridors to Elara's room, not sure what she was looking for, maybe just proximity to the reason she was still here. She found Cassian asleep in a chair beside his daughter's bed, his head tilted back at an angle that would hurt his neck when he woke, his face unguarded in sleep. Younger somehow, the weight of control temporarily lifted. Elara slept peacefully for once, no nightmares, just deep, steady breathing, one small hand curled around a stuffed rabbit that had appeared on her bed recently, probably from Cassian, though he'd never mentioned it. Maya stood in the doorway watching them, father and daughter, both so damaged by loss and fear, and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The recognition that Cassian was as trapped as she was, just in a cage of his own making. She sat on the floor across from his chair, her back against the wall, soft lamplight making shadows dance across pastel walls and scattered stuffed animals, and waited. Cassian woke after 20 minutes, his eyes opening all at once the way vampires did, no gradual surfacing, and he saw Maya and went very still, defensive, waiting for attack or accusation. Maya spoke first, her voice quiet so as not to wake Elara, and said, "I can't stay if you won't let me choose to stay. The bracelet and the contract and the guards, they make me a prisoner, not a partner. And Elara needs a partner who's here willingly, not someone who's trapped." Cassian looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and something in his face crumbled, the careful control giving way to exhaustion and fear, and maybe the beginning of recognition that he couldn't force healing any more than he could force loyalty. He stood slowly, moved to Maya with the careful grace of predators who'd learned to be gentle, and knelt on the floor in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver threaded through his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes, the humanity underneath the vampire mythology. He reached for her wrist, the one with the bracelet, and his fingers were steady when they found the hidden clasp, the mechanism only he could open, and the metal fell away, leaving her skin pale underneath, marked with a faint scar in the shape of the filigree, permanent evidence of magic and binding. Maya stared at her bare wrist, feeling lighter and more terrified in equal measure, and Cassian set the bracelet on the floor between them and said, "If you leave, I won't stop you. No guards, no pursuit, but I'm asking you to stay, for her, for the progress we've made, for the possibility that we can figure out how to do this without cages." His voice was raw, honest in a way she'd never heard from him, and Maya understood this was surrender. The vampire king giving up the one thing he valued above everything else, control. gambling, that trust might work where force had failed. She looked at Elara sleeping peacefully, at Jamie in the next room probably awake and listening through the walls, at the bracelet glinting in lamplight, and she thought about the woman in the gray suit and the safe house address she'd memorized and burned, about the market and normal life and freedom that felt impossibly distant. She thought about Alara's nightmares and her small hand covered in blood and the way she'd whispered, "Are you going to leave too?" And Maya knew that leaving now would break something in the child that might never heal, would confirm every fear about abandonment and loss, would undo months of careful trust building. She picked up the bracelet, felt its weight, its warmth returning as it recognized her skin, and she fastened it back around her wrist, the clasp clicking into place with finality. Cassian's eyes widened, surprise and relief, and something grateful moving across his features. And Maya said 1 year. Then we renegotiate. You give me real autonomy. Let me make decisions about Alara's care. Stop monitoring my every move. And at the end of 12 months, I decide if I stay or go, and you respect that decision. No magic, no force, just my choice. Cassian nodded slowly, something like hope replacing the constant fear in his expression, and he said 1 year, negotiable terms, your choice. And then he added quietly, almost to himself, I don't know how to do this, how to protect without controlling, how to love without imprisoning. And Maya said, I don't know either, but we'll figure it out or we'll fail trying. And either way, it has to be different than what we've been doing. They sat in silence for a moment, the palace waking around them, distant sounds of staff beginning morning routines, and Cassian said thank you, for staying, for trying, for not giving up on her. And Maya wanted to say she was staying for herself too, because walking away felt impossible now that she loved Elara. But she just nodded and stood and said, I'm going to make breakfast. You should sleep in a real bed. And Cassian almost smiled, tired and genuine, and said, I'll try. Maya walked back to her suite through corridors that looked different in pre-dawn light, pale blue washing over marble and silver, the palace less like a prison and more like a place that could be negotiated, lived in, survived. Jamie was awake sitting on her bed, and he looked at her wrist, at the bracelet back in place, and said, You put it back on. And Maya said yes, but this time it was my choice. And that matters even if it looks the same from outside. Jamie considered this with the seriousness of children who'd learned too young that adults made complicated decisions for complicated reasons, and he said, Okay, I trust you. And Maya pulled him close and hoped she deserved that trust. Elara appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown, the bandage on her hand smaller now, healing visible. And she looked at Maya and then at Jamie and said quietly, tentatively, Can I have breakfast with you both? And Maya said, Of course, sweetheart, always. They walked together to the small dining room in the family wing, Maya in the middle with Jamie on one side and Elara on the other, the little girl reaching for both their hands, and Maya felt the weight of her choice settle into something bearable, not easy, but possible. A path forward through compromise and boundaries, and the hope that love could exist without total control. The palace was fully awake now, staff moving through corridors, guards changing shifts, the machinery of Cassian's world humming its constant background rhythm. And Maya thought about the 5-year contract she'd modified to 1, about the bracelet she'd chosen to wear, about the vampire king learning to release his grip 1 finger at a time. They were sitting down to eggs and toast when Maya noticed the envelope, black paper propped against her coffee cup, sealed with red wax that looked ominous in morning light. No name, no return address, just the weight of something significant. She opened it while Jamie and Elara ate, their voices soft and normal, and inside was a single sentence in precise silver script that read, The Vampire King's enemies are now yours. Choose your allies carefully. Maya's hand tightened on the paper, her other hand automatically going to the bracelet that hummed its steady pulse. and she looked out the window at the palace grounds where guards patrolled perimeters and cameras tracked movement, and Cassian's world of threats and control suddenly felt less paranoid and more justified. She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, her mind already cataloging questions and concerns, and the understanding that staying meant inheriting not just Elara's trust, but Cassian's enemies, that the woman in the gray suit had been a warning and a recruitment, that the game was larger than one family's trauma and extended into vampire politics Maya didn't understand. Elara laughed at something Jamie said, a clear, bright sound, and Maya committed to memory the way the morning light caught in her dark hair, the healing wound on her small hand, the trust in her expression, because these were the reasons Maya had chosen to stay. The fragile hope that she could help this child heal while maintaining enough autonomy to survive the Vampire King's gratitude. The letter in her pocket felt heavy, ominous, a reminder that the world outside the palace hadn't forgotten about them, that Maya's visibility as the woman who'd reached the unreachable child made her valuable and therefore vulnerable, that choosing to stay meant choosing all the complications that came with it. She thought about allies and enemies, and the fact that she'd signed a one-year contract with a vampire king who'd just learned to release control, and Maya understood with perfect clarity that the next 12 months would test every boundary they'd just negotiated, that the quiet aftermath of their showdown was temporary, that somewhere in the city or beyond it, people were watching and planning and deciding how to use Maya's connection to Elara and Cassian for their own purposes. But for now, this morning, in this moment, there was breakfast and laughter and two children who trusted her, and a vampire king who'd removed a magical binding because she'd asked him to respect her choice, and that felt like progress, even if it was fragile and uncertain. Maya sipped her coffee and watched Jamie teach Elara how to fold her napkin into a bird, their heads bent together, and she touched the bracelet on her wrist, chosen not forced, and thought about the year ahead with equal parts hope and dread, knowing she'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Knowing that love and freedom and survival in the Vampire King's world required constant negotiation and the willingness to walk away, even when walking away would break your heart. And Maya had just proven she had that willingness even if she'd chosen not to use it yet.